freedom of information.
Cool. Well, how many people here have ever put in a freedom of information request? So we've got two or three, yeah, brilliant. Okay, well, I will make this a kind of simple introduction, but you can, I find putting in FOI requests is very simple. It can be quite hard to get, sometimes it can be harder to get the information that you want, but that's kind of a matter of persistence and practice, I think. And once you get into it, I find it something that's quite addictive. So once you've done one, you really, really want to start doing more because they're very brilliant and you get some very interesting stuff back if you get lucky sometimes. So the Freedom of Information Act was brought in a number of years ago after a big campaign that was run to kind of basically kind of break open some of the kind of secrecy surrounding the state and surrounding the way in which governments make decisions and any public authority for that matter. It applies to all public authorities in the UK and means that you, as a citizen, have a right to request information from any public authority. There is also two other pieces of relevant legislation. One is called the Environmental Information Regulations. That's an EU piece of legislation, also reflects an EU directive. That's came in more recently. It's quite a lot stronger than the Freedom of Information Act, but it is only really restricted to environmental stuff, environmental information, as the name suggests, so things like pollution monitoring. Obviously, that's very relevant to us, and so in many cases we would be wanting to use EIRs, Environmental Information Regulation requests, in preference to FOIs. So what can we use, I'll perhaps maybe not talk about the Data Protection Act yet, because we'll come on to that later maybe if we've got time, but what do we use it for? I mean, it's something that's really useful as a campaigning tool to whip out bits of information about things that maybe the government have been, or local authorities have been discussing, but maybe didn't necessarily want to share with everyone. It can be really useful for creating stories in the media. It can be really useful, of course, for holding decision makers to account ultimately. And I think that's why it's a really, really useful campaigning tool. So, what does it mean to submit an FOI request? Well, it's very simple. I'll read you out one that I've done recently. I use this not as a sort of necessarily example of something that's particularly good, but just as an example of that it's very easy to do. And there's obviously lots of FOI requests that have been done and have been supremely successful. And this is just an example to kind of take you through the process very quickly. So I decided I wanted to make a freedom of information request to DEFRA, to the Department of the Environment. And I wanted to know basically whether Owen Paterson, the Environment Secretary, had been briefed properly on climate change. Because he's come out with many statements in the past suggesting that he doesn't actually know very much about climate change, or at least if he does, he's certainly been reading the wrong website. So I sent an email to them saying, "Dear Sir or Madam, I'm writing to request information under the Freedom of Information Act 2000. Under the Act, I'm requesting the following. All briefings given to the Secretary of State, Owen Paterson, on the subject of the science of climate change between the 3rd of September 2012 to the present, which was the date in which he started as Secretary of State. In any circumstances where such briefings are decided to be withheld, in other words, you don't decide not to give them to me, I ask that you please release the title and the date of the briefing. So at least if they didn't give me that, they would be giving me some information about it. Please send it to my email address. Thanks a lot." 20 days later, which is the statutory time limit on when they're meant to get back to you by 20 working days, they sent me back an email saying, "Thanks a lot for your request. We're deciding to extend. We do hold some information on this, but we're going to have a think about it. We're going to ask for another 20 days until we decide whether or not to release anything." So this is often what an authority will do if they've got something which they've got the information, but they're a little bit unsure about it. They're a bit sensitive about it, and they want to basically do what's called undertake a public interest test. So a public interest test is where they say, right, we've got this information, but it may not be in the public interest to release the information, or it might be. And they run a whole series of public interest tests, and we might talk about that a bit in a minute, because there's various things which you can do around that, kind of things that they say are exempt, make information exempt from being released. but then there's a kind of often a very strong public interest for them being released, because anyway. So another 20 days went by, twiddling my thumbs, obviously, sitting on the edge of my seat, and finally it did come back, and they said, dear Mr. Shropstall, thank you for your request for information. We've actually decided to handle this request under the Environmental Information Regulations Act, so the EIR. So they'd actually themselves, which was very, very good of them, they'd actually themselves decided to look at it under a tougher set of regulations. So that was very nice of them. I didn't ask for that, but that was very nice, because that's good. That shows good practice. And they said, from the 3rd of September until the date of your request, the Secretary of State for the Environment has received 2 briefings on the science of climate change. They are attached. No other briefings pertaining to the science of climate change have been sent to the Secretary of State. I decided that was quite a bad thing, and then I decided to phone the Independent, and then they ran the story about it. So obviously I'm very pleased by that. And as I said, lots of people have done much better requests than that and made much bigger stories. But I think that just demonstrates that you can, with a bit of patience and persistence and getting the kind of lucky with and getting the right question and getting lucky on it, you can create quite an interesting story and something, a bit of a storm of furore about how little the supposed Secretary of State for the Environment even knows about climate change and has been briefed on it in the last year since he got appointed. So anyway, that was to demonstrate a few things. It doesn't take very much just to put in a request. It's just a very short communication, an email or a letter to the relevant public authority. You just can invoke one of the acts, but again, if they've got a good FOI officer in the department, then they should be, they should have an interest in using the correct act to interpret it. So in this case, they decided to actually, through EIRs, even if I've said FOIs, but it's probably a good thing to sort of say, and both, if you want to be absolutely sure. In my request, I tried to be as specific as possible in what I'd asked for. So it said, all briefings given to the Secretary of State, so that was a specific form of information, a specific briefing to somebody. So in this case it was the Secretary of State. You might want to be asking for, all briefings given to the head of the council or to the chief scientific advisor at DEFRA or DEC or something like that, but just specify who, if you can. And then specifying the subject, on the subject of the science of climate change. And finally I gave a set of dates between which the information I thought would have been produced. If there was any information it would have been that I'm interested in, it was being produced between when the Secretary of State arrived and between then and the present. Now, I think being specific is really important with FOI requests if you can, because then it allows them to have fewer options for turning it down. One of the most common reasons for turning down a request or refusing to release information is because it's deemed to be manifestly unreasonable, something I've had quite a lot, or not that much. That's only if I haven't necessarily been specific enough that they can really come back with that. Or they've said it basically exceeds cost limits, and there are some cost limits on how much public time essentially you can use up with making such requests. And that's understandable, but obviously you sometimes have to sort of argue a case that actually I have been very specific in this request. It's really not going to take you very much time to do edit find within a document or whatever to say here's some information and you can have it. And so sometimes you can sometimes they might come back to you and say actually it's going to cost us too much, and there's a limit which is about £600 or 3.5 days, notionally 3.5 days work by a central government department, which is the limit for an FOI, the amount of time they can spend on answering an FOI request. You can counter that often by being a bit more specific, so putting in some dates or something like that. This stage, I don't know, Jake, if it's worth just mentioning a few of the other things that sometimes government departments or authorities can come back with and say, this is another reason for not giving up the information.
Definitely, yeah. Yes, a couple of things spring to mind. The exemption that we get quoted back at us under the Freedom of Information Act all the time is that this is policy in development. There's a specific exemption in the Freedom of Information Act. It's section 35, if you're interested. And it specifically, unfortunately, does what it says on the tin. In other words, if government hasn't made up its mind yet about what it wants to do, it doesn't have to share the documents with you where it's trying to make up its mind. That's a bit of a pity, because it means that when there's a right royal Barney going on inside government, you can't necessarily use freedom of information legislation to find out more about it, and that is a bit of a shame. Now, of course, once a decision has been taken, you can get round that exemption, because you can say, well, no, government policy isn't in development on this point anymore. You've taken a decision, can I now see the papers about the right royal Barney? Not that you would draft it like that. The other absolute classic exemption that's quite difficult to find your way around is ministerial correspondence and cabinet communications. So they both, again, more or less do what they say on the tin. Ministerial correspondence is letters, emails, what have you, going to and from ministers. That's very, very difficult to get hold of. It's not impossible, and we do it. We have done it, actually, haven't we? But it is difficult to achieve. Still more difficult is cabinet communication. So Guy put in this really great one not so long ago in relation to cabinet papers, didn't you, around the MOD and so on, and which would have been really, really great had it come off. But there is more or less a presumption against releasing cabinet papers. And you can sort of understand what that's about, because there's that whole 30-year rule you'll remember about releasing cabinet papers. And if you could get round that through the freedom of information legislation, then that rule would basically just fall away. Or maybe it should, but it would. It's not quite where we are. So those are two pitfalls which you really want to look out for. A couple of other little pitfallettes. One is if you're asking for something which is already in the public domain, that obviously the public authority can simply come back to you and say, no, that's already in the public domain. You can get hold of that by other means. Now, if they're feeling helpful, what they will sometimes do is they'll write back to you and say, it's in the public domain and here's where to find it. That's when they're feeling nice. When they're not feeling nice, they'll just say, it's in the public domain, go find it. Which isn't ideal. That's one. And then the other thing, which we've come up against quite a bit around shale gas, is confidentiality, possibly the most overused phrase in the whole of English law, whereby basically papers which are confidential are again potentially exempt. Now, the confidentiality exclusion is still subject to the public interest test that Guy has referred to. So the public authority still has to weigh up the public interest in withholding against the public interest in disclosure. So it isn't an absolute exemption. There are absolute exemptions. This is not one of them. So if the public authority does come back and says, oh, good Lord, all these letters I've exchanged with Quadrilla are clearly confidential, you can push back on the basis of the public interest test and say, well, sorry, we think the public interest in disclosure exceeds, it outweighs the public interest in not doing so. So that's the other one to bear in mind. A couple of other small points. If you're unhappy with your decision, mostly public authorities will offer a review. It's pretty worthless because the person reviewing it is still a member of the public authority. So they're rather unlikely to disagree with the first person's view. But it might just come up, occasionally it does. And the final fallback is the Information Tribunal. It's massively overworked. It's part of the Information Commission, it's part of that whole network, whole empire based up in Cheshire. It's massively overworked. It's inundated with requests, as you can imagine. If you really want to push the point, you can try, but it's going to take a while, and it could still just result in a slap on the wrists for the person who's the public body that's done something wrong. But it's there.
Awesome. Shane. I guess I'd just say one or two other things, which is ultimately I think it comes down to a successful FOI request comes down to knowing, having a bit of background understanding of the issue, really, and really knowing where to start to look for where the bodies are, essentially. So if you just sort of put in an FOI request to a department and said, give us everything you got on nuclear, well, firstly they'll come back and say, way too much information, go away. If you then, went in and asked for something, which was like, give me everything you've got on nuclear for a certain sort of dates, or you might get something, but perhaps not something very interesting. But then if you know that there's something particular that's sort of an incident you've got to be able to have a tip-off about, or you have to be able to speak to somebody who used to work there, for instance, or something. Obviously, that never happens, obviously. Nobody ever does that sort of, reaches that sort of conference. But, if hypothetically, you happen to find that out, and you then start to go looking for it by putting particular requests, then you might have more chance. It might just be that you get lucky sometimes. I think I've got lucky with some of my requests because I happen to have put in a request to the department about a particular issue where there's clearly people on the inside who are a bit angry about the way the decision went, and they just went, sure, have all the correspondence. Just, yeah, I'm as pissed off as you. So, which is great, obviously, if that happens. Very lucky. We've got some briefings, which I can pass around later, which include a bit more information. There are much more comprehensive briefings online. I've given links in here to some of them as well. For instance, by the Campaign for Freedom of Information, who runs basically body the FOI Act in the first place, and they've got quite a comprehensive guide. And another useful thing to do is to look on, because if you're looking at central government have got a lot more organised about their publication schemes more recently, because they've got this one.gov.uk website. I think it's actually quite good if you can see a lot of FOI requests all in one place that have already been released. So if you wanted to start looking into something, you can have a look and see what already people have been asking for, and if they've had any success with getting that information in the past. And that's quite a useful site. There's a link to that one. And there is a very helpful website called FOI Directory, which gives you pretty much all the FOI email addresses for departments and for local authorities in the UK as well. Although strictly, you don't necessarily have to just email the FOI officer, the person in charge of FOI. You could just all you have to do is send an email or letter to the authority, and they will have to process it.
One of the quick ones, just to say, a purely practical one is just multiple requests can sometimes work out quite nicely. So we had one on shale gas actually, which worked out really nicely, where it's built on your point, Guy, about when people in the public authority are peed off as we are about the decision. It's a little bit like that, but in other words, you submit the same request to a number of different organised public bodies, all of whom have an interest in the issue. So we did this in particular where we went to DEC, so Energy and Climate Change, we went to DEFRA, we went to the Environment Agency and to the Treasury. Treasury told us to buzz off, because they always do, but the Environment Agency and DEFRA disagreed about what information needed to be disclosed. And the disagreement proved quite telling. It proved really quite interesting. Basically, DEFRA ditched the Environment Agency into you-know-what, which was great. It was really helpful, and we found out lots about what the Environment Agency was doing, not from them, but from their parent department, which was nice.
So does it help at all if different people submit the same request, or that's not?
I mean, do you want
a dozen people asking the same person the same thing?
I'm always tempted to sort of try and get loads of people to do that, and thought that before, but it unfortunately doesn't really work, because if it becomes obvious that suddenly the department has had sort of, 1,000 or even 10 requests which are for exactly the same thing or for a very similar thing, then they decide that either this is what they call vexatious, just causing a nuisance to yourself, aren't you? Or that they're obviously linked in some sort of concerted campaign, so that it's just not there. Although you reply to it once, I think, so.
Absolutely, agreed. The other thing to bear in mind, this is super ambitious, but the other thing to bear in mind is that under the Freedom of Information Act, every public authority is required to have what's called a publication scheme. So in other words, a document that sets out the kinds of documents, kinds of information they will publish in any event, of information that they're not going to hang on to, information they're not going to refuse to disclose. So one possible starting point is to go to the publication scheme, the publications document, and find out whether the kind of information you're after is in principle captured in that document. Because if it is, you just go to the public authority and you say, actually what I want is covered by paragraph X of your publication scheme, can I now have it please? And then they're in a very sticky wicket to say no. The other alternative, and this is super ambitious, is to try to influence the terms of the publication scheme itself, but that's very difficult to do. I stunned you into something.
So when something is done by an outsourced body, for example, the only example I can think of is a sort of waste authority or something. You want to know about recycling or something. I mean, how does that work? How do you do that?
Could
you apply to the outsourced body, or
There are two possible ways of going around that. Now, first off, generally, if there's a contract in place between a public authority and a contractor, generally they will have allocated FOI risk as between them. So what you'll generally find is that a request that goes into the contractor will get spat out back to the public authority, and the public authority will then have to handle it. The difficulty comes in who's got what information. Because if, again, somebody is playing silly bugs, if the public authority doesn't want to comply, it may well start saying, well, I haven't got that. Actually, the contractor's got it. Yeah, and where did they get it? Did they get it from you? You know, so you get into a little bit of a crazy one. There's quite a bit of case law, including from the Information Tribunal, about when a contractor for a public authority is effectively caught by the Act in their own right. And the short answer is that in certain circumstances, they are in their own right. But I would need to go back to the case law to give you a view on that. But it's worth a go, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think we won a case on that, didn't we? An incinerator case.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, we got information about the contracts
Okay.
and about how much money had been paid out. That was quite a good one.
That was the other exemption I should probably mention. I was going to build on confidentiality. They've got trade secrets, commercial in confidence. So that's an absolute classic. So every time you go sniffing around the terms of the EDF deal for Hinkley, you know, whatever it is, you know, the stuff that hasn't been published, you know, not the 14 billion, but the other stuff. Commercial in confidence.
Were you just going to briefly touch on data protection?
Sorry, yeah. Data protection, all I was really going to say is you can use the Data Protection Act to get information on yourself, basically.
So like a subject access request or something?
Exactly, yeah. So to police force or obviously that doesn't allow you to get information on personal details of other people, only yourself. That would be a bit against the
There is, this is probably getting out too complicated, but I'm going to try it just in case. There's a loop between the DPA, the Data Protection Act, and the Freedom of Information Act. So, if you go in with a request under the Freedom of Information Act, the public authority can say, oh, no, you can't have that, it's protected by the Data Protection Act. And that, I'm afraid, is jolly difficult to get around. So there is a loop which you can go around where you're trying to get around the fact that you can't see it because it's someone else's data. But then on a freedom of information, the public authority can say, no, it's someone else's data, you can't have it. Now, the best way around that is redaction. So in other words, where people's details are simply blanked out. And you can ask for redaction specifically sometimes in your request. You can say, if this contains personal data, please redact as necessary to ensure that you comply with the DPA and still provide the information. Because generally you don't need people's names. You can guess.